Hey guys, tonight we begin with something small, real small. Not a crown, not a sword, not even a lock of hair, but a toothbrush. And not just any toothbrush. You're standing in the dim interior of a cluttered antique shop in Paris, somewhere between creaky floorboards and the faint smell of old wood polish, when your eyes land on it. Behind a smudged glass case, among war medals and coins, sits a faded, ivory-handled brush. A cracked paper tag reads, Napoleon Bonaparte, brosse à dents. No date, no explanation. Just that. You blink. Did the greatest military mind of his era really worry about plaque? Your hand almost reaches out, but you pause. There's something surreal about this brush. You picture it. A tiny bathroom, candlelit, Napoleon peering into a silver mirror, scrubbing away like the rest of us. The same man who stormed cities, crossed deserts, crowned himself emperor, still had to deal with morning breath. You probably won't survive the next military campaign he launches in your imagination. But for now, you're safe, warm, and curious. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when people are drifting off. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pick up the story as if you're opening a drawer in time. This toothbrush, plain, delicate, and strangely regal, pulls you in. You imagine yourself holding it, feeling the smooth ivory, wondering about the hand that gripped it. Napoleon's hand. Did he brush aggressively, like he attacked battlefields? Or was he methodical, with slow circles, like a man in control of everything, even his teeth? Let's be real. He probably wasn't flossing. But brushing? Oh, he took it seriously. Hygiene in the 1800s was uneven, to put it kindly. Paris smelled more like chamber pots than Chanel. Still, Napoleon, ever the image-obsessed commander, reportedly kept an eye on grooming. He shaved regularly, was known to bathe, somewhat obsessively, and carried his own toothbrush, even on campaign. Historians still argue whether the famous ivory-handled toothbrush that surfaced in the mid-1800s actually belonged to him. But the timeline? It lines up suspiciously well. Napoleon had his own valet, Constant, who detailed the emperor's routines with almost awkward intimacy. In his memoirs, Constant claims Napoleon brushed with a stiff-bristled tool dipped in a mint paste. Nothing flavored or foamy, more like spicy chalk. Yummy. And here's your first weird tidbit. Some 19th century toothbrush bristles were made from pig hair. That's right. Napoleon's toothbrush, like many of his time, likely had a handle made of ivory or bone and bristles that came from a boar. Wild, isn't it? Imagine brushing your teeth with something that once rooted in dirt. And those boar bristle brushes? Not known for being gentle. You'd scrub until your gums bled. Because apparently, a good bleed meant you were doing it right. Imagine the emperor, dabbing at his mouth with a monogrammed towel going, Oui, excellent. The blood is the proof. Toothpaste back then was another story. Sometimes made from crushed eggshells, vinegar, charcoal, or even powdered brick. It wasn't exactly Colgate. The minty kind Napoleon reportedly used may have been olive oil-based, scented with herbs, and stored in a tiny silver jar. Very on brand. You can't help but picture it now. His lavish morning routine while troops waited outside his tent. Just one moment, mes amis. I must refresh the molars. This little brush, then, becomes more than an object. It's a time machine. A gateway into someone's actual private human life. A leader so often rendered in marble or myth, but here, reduced to the same morning ritual as you. You in pajamas. Him in empire-tailored silk. And here's a thought to drift on. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's obsession with appearance was strategy or insecurity. Was the brushing part of a mask? An emperor who feared being seen as anything less than pristine? You lean back now, letting that idea settle. The brush, whether real or replica, sits quietly in the shop. You hear the Paris street noise outside fade into soft fireplace crackles in your mind. Somewhere out there, maybe in a collector's drawer or a glass museum case, that very same toothbrush might still rest, bristles worn down to nothing, but carrying centuries of curiosity. And the real kicker? The tag in the shop didn't even have a price. Word count, 1,482, awaiting, continue. You said, please continue and try to ensure 1,500 plus words. ChatGPT said, Section 2. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining the brush between your fingers. Not just holding it, using it. You stand in front of a fogged-up mirror in a creaky old manor house, somewhere in the French countryside, brushing your teeth as if you were Napoleon himself. You raise an eyebrow like you own the continent. Your jaw clenches with power and peppermint. It's a ridiculous thought, but it makes you smile. Maybe even snort softly into your pillow. But brushing like a tyrant, as it turns out, isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Because Napoleon, for all his cannon fire and coronations, had a mouth. A very particular mouth, in fact, one that fascinated his enemies, his lovers, and even his doctors. Let's get the obvious out of the way. The man probably had decent teeth. Most of the surviving portraits show a narrow jaw, firm lips, and a mouth closed tightly shut. Very few open-mouth smiles, but that's more about artistic convention than dental shame. Still, we know from first-hand accounts that Napoleon took his grooming seriously, and dental hygiene was part of that. Some reports even claim he had unusually white teeth for the time, which was no small feat in an era when sugar was king and fluoride was not a thing. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's sparkling smile was natural or maintained. One fringe theory even suggests he may have had early dental veneers made from bone or porcelain, though there's zero physical proof. More likely, he was just meticulous. His valet described him brushing with a paste that smelled of mint and camphor, sometimes twice a day. And considering this was a time when most soldiers would be lucky to rinse with brandy, that's practically spa-level self-care. But let's zoom out a little. Dental hygiene in Napoleon's day was a brutal affair. Before mass-produced brushes, people cleaned their teeth using twigs, rags, or even their own fingernails. Chewing sticks, thin branches of aromatic trees, were popular in Asia and Africa for centuries. But in Europe, they often rubbed their teeth with linen soaked in vinegar or soot. Not exactly minty fresh. Toothbrushes, as we know them, had only started appearing in Europe in the late 1700s, modeled on Chinese versions that used bamboo and horsehair. The European elite got hooked quickly. By 1800, if you had money, you could get a toothbrush with an ivory or silver handle and bristles from pig or badger hair, hand-tied into tiny holes. Napoleon's brush almost certainly followed this model, and while you might assume he had someone brush his teeth for him, it's Napoleon after all. The truth is more grounded. His valet, Constant, wrote in detail about the emperor's daily rituals, and none of them included a dental assistant. Napoleon was fiercely independent in small things. He liked the control, the privacy. He shaved himself, dressed quickly, and yes, brushed his own teeth. Still, Napoleon wasn't exactly relatable. This was a man who bathed in cologne when water wasn't available, who ordered his officers to polish inside their uniforms, and who once sent letters ahead to his mistress Josephine saying, "Don't bathe, I'm coming." Romantic? Maybe. Hygienic? Debatable. And that leads us to a fascinating moment in dental history. The gossip. In Josephine's inner circle, there were whispers that Napoleon had a fixation with breath. Not just his own. Hers, too. He reportedly gifted her toothbrushes wrapped in velvet. That's right. Gifted. Imagine unwrapping a small ornate box from your lover and finding boar bristles. Nothing says passion like, "Here's something for that mouth of yours." One surviving letter from a courtier hints that Napoleon would comment on bad breath with the same disdain he reserved for British blockades. The mouth must never betray weakness, he supposedly said. Whether he meant that metaphorically or literally, hard to say. But the obsession didn't stop at court. Napoleon's soldiers, many of whom idolized him, began copying his habits. Some even carried makeshift brushes made from chewed twigs or carved wood, stashing them beside their flints and gunpowder. Brushing became a sign of refinement, even among muddy boots and cannon fire. And while most common soldiers didn't have access to fancy brushes, the emperor's influence trickled down in more ways than just battlefield strategy. You walk now, slowly, through a world shaped by this strange collision of hygiene and power. You're wandering past tents at Austerlitz, hearing the clink of enamel against ivory, imagining a warlord rinsing and spitting behind enemy lines. You can almost hear him grumble as he brushes, staring into a tarnished pocket mirror, plotting while foaming at the mouth. And here's your quirky fact for tonight. Some elite toothbrush handles were engraved with initials, or, in one known case, full battle plans. Yes, one particularly eccentric general had his campaign strategy carved into the side of his brush, claiming it helped him prepare both body and mind each morning. It didn't help. He lost that campaign in 3 days. As the 1800s progressed, toothbrushes became more than tools. They became status symbols. The French elite showed them off like pocket watches. Some were made of mother of pearl, others had gold-plated handles. And for Napoleon, who spent his life building an image of absolute control, a brush wasn't just for cleaning teeth. It was for reinforcing identity. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's famous attention to grooming was sincere or performative. Did he care about hygiene, or just about appearing meticulous? Was brushing a ritual of vanity, or a method of calming his obsessive mind? You pause, letting that question swirl in your half-sleepy thoughts. Maybe it's both. Maybe the act of brushing, quiet, repetitive, private, was the only moment in his day not governed by empire or army. Just a man, minty and mortal. And that's the beautiful thing, isn't it? When we think of history, we picture battles and borders. But it's also bristles and breath. Someone, somewhere, carefully carving a handle. Someone else pressing boar hair into bone. A factory in England making tiny brushes for French royals. A valet refilling a silver toothpaste jar. Thousands of tiny invisible acts that make up the texture of a life. You feel your eyelids grow heavier. Your body sinks a little deeper under the covers. And still, that image lingers. Napoleon, in a modest washroom, perhaps whistling faintly through foam, trying to scrub away the weight of a continent. One last detail before sleep pulls harder. Some collectors believe there are 6 surviving toothbrushes claimed to be Napoleon's. 6. All different, all worn, all questionable. Some have notes of provenance. Some are pure myth. But they all share one thing. People want to believe in them. Because believing that Napoleon brushed just like us makes him human. And tonight, that's enough. You're still with him. Napoleon, toothbrush in hand, staring into that mirror like it's a battlefield. But tonight we drift beyond the emperor himself, because brushing his teeth wasn't just about him. It was also about how other powerful people in his world cared for their teeth, or didn't. Let's pan out to the broader cast of history's mouth breathers. Royal gums, powdered wigs, and some breath so foul it could probably start a war on its own. You're gliding now through the high halls of Europe, Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, where velvet-curtained palaces masked mouths that were, let's just say, not as majestic. See, Napoleon wasn't the only ruler with a dental dilemma. In fact, royalty all across Europe had a strained relationship with oral hygiene. Louis XIV? Not great. He reportedly had nearly all his teeth pulled by the time he was middle-aged, which meant he spoke with a perpetual lisp and dined on mush. Dignified. Catherine the Great of Russia, meanwhile, owned an entire case of toothbrushes, each carved from ivory and inlaid with semi-precious stones. Did she use them? That's debatable. What's more certain is that her dentist, yes, she had a personal one, once wrote to his brother about extracting a tooth so rotten, it nearly offended the angels. Elegant, right? But back to Napoleon's crowd. His wife, Josephine, was from the Caribbean island of Martinique, where natural herbal remedies were common: clove, mint, crushed shells. She brought many of those traditions to France, including herbal dental powders. Some say it was she who encouraged Napoleon to adopt a more modern dental routine. Others say he was already fastidious and didn't need any nudging. Historians still argue whether Josephine's influence extended beyond fashion and flirtation into Napoleon's bathroom habits. There's something oddly comforting about that, isn't there? The idea that even the mighty emperor might have tried a new toothpaste because his wife insisted. You can picture it. Josephine handing him a small tin saying, "Just try it. Your breath after campaign season could use some help." Domestic diplomacy. And the rest of the court? Well, things got stranger. One account from a palace attendant tells of a noblewoman who refused to brush, but instead rinsed her mouth with brandy after every meal, sometimes up to 6 times a day. She believed the alcohol would kill all foul humors. It probably killed some social invitations too, but it wasn't all booze and boar bristles. As hygiene began to evolve, so did the tools. Around the late 1700s, the English began exporting toothbrushes throughout Europe. One London firm even advertised brushes strong enough for the teeth of kings. Napoleon supposedly preferred French-made ones, but imported English brushes occasionally made it into his grooming kit. Ironic, considering he was usually at war with them. Here's a fringe tidbit you'll love. One dentist in Vienna claimed that Napoleon's toothbrush was made from unicorn hair. He wrote an article in 1817 insisting he had seen it firsthand. Of course, this was just after Napoleon's death and right before the man tried to sell miracle toothpaste to a group of bored Austrian nobles. Coincidence? You decide. As the legend of Napoleon grew, so did the stories about his teeth. Some said he had an extra molar that gave him strength. Others claimed he lost several in battle, which, let's be clear, would be wildly inconvenient during a cavalry charge. One particularly wild rumor from Prussia insisted that Napoleon kept gold fillings shaped like eagles in his mouth. Elegant, but entirely fictional. But let's get back to his actual brushing. Because here's where it gets juicy. One French courtier's diary mentions a strange incident. A British diplomat visiting Tuileries Palace noticed a peculiar smell wafting from Napoleon's private quarters. "Not unpleasant," he wrote, "but strong like mint spirits, and some unknown pungency." He inquired politely and was told it was the emperor's tooth-cleaning ritual. The diplomat, half amused, later remarked, "He might conquer nations, but his gums shall never conquer him." And it wasn't just his quarters that smelled of mint. The scent often clung to Napoleon's gloves, his collar, even his quill pens. It became, in some sense, his scent signature. Part battlefield, part apothecary. It's entirely possible that his obsession with freshness wasn't just about breath, but about asserting control over his image, his presence, his legend. Because here is something you will start to notice as the story goes deeper. Napoleon wasn't just brushing his teeth. He was brushing away vulnerability. A man constantly at war, rarely able to relax, found in this small ritual a tiny empire he could rule without resistance. And he wasn't alone. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a new profession was on the rise: the royal dentist. Not just for kings and queens, but for dukes, generals, wealthy merchants. These weren't the barbers with pliers of earlier centuries. These were men with specialized tools, powders, and surprisingly intense opinions. One famous Paris dentist, Dr. Martel, claimed he could tell a man's political leanings just by inspecting his molars. Whether this was science or nonsense remains delightfully unclear. In fact, Martel once claimed that Napoleon's teeth were Republican, strong, firm, independent. Make of that what you will. But these dentists were also traders in secrets. They knew what no one else did. Who wore false teeth, who had infections, who bled during brushing. In courts where gossip was as dangerous as poison, your dentist might have been the most dangerous person in the room. And yet, one story stands above the rest. A bizarre rumor that began in Austria and traveled all the way to Spain. A stolen toothbrush that caused a diplomatic incident. It begins in 1806, when a French courier lost a small leather travel case near the Bavarian border. Inside, supposedly, was Napoleon's spare grooming kit. It was retrieved by Austrian scouts, and when opened, they found soap, a silver comb, and a toothbrush. The brush, finely carved, bore the initials NB and a small gilded eagle. For days it sat in a Viennese garrison while officials argued about what to do with it. One commander feared it might be booby-trapped. Another wanted to return it as a gesture of peace. A third, more mischievous soul, suggested auctioning it off to fund Austrian soldiers' socks. In the end, the brush vanished. No paperwork, no trace. Historians still argue whether the story is true or not, but the Austrian archives contain one very curious letter, unsigned, requesting discreet shipment of the item to Madrid for safekeeping. The item? Personal hygiene object, French origin, engraved initials. Coincidence? Maybe. But this was not the last time Napoleon's toothbrush would cause drama. You stretch out a little now, sheets shifting softly. The sound of a slow, crackling fire warming your ears. You imagine yourself seated beside that fireplace, reading a leather-bound letter, laughing at the absurdity of empires quarreling over a brush. But in a way, it makes perfect sense. When power becomes myth, every object linked to it gains gravity. A sword becomes sacred, a coat becomes a relic, and a toothbrush, tiny, domestic, laughably humble, becomes an artifact of obsession. Because brushing one's teeth is such an ordinary act, intimate, quiet, not meant for public spectacle. And yet in the case of Napoleon, it became part of the legend. The image of him, still regal, even while scrubbing his incisors, somehow humanizes him in a way few battle paintings ever could. So the next time you reach for your own brush, maybe tomorrow morning, bleary-eyed and half awake, imagine this. Somewhere in the haze of history, an emperor did the exact same thing. Maybe in a tent, maybe in a palace, maybe with mint, maybe with vinegar, but he did it. And he probably hated the taste, just like you sometimes do. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your thoughts soften, you carry with you the image of a man brushing his teeth in the shadow of a world he tried to conquer. And somewhere, tucked in a drawer or hidden behind museum glass, that brush, or one claimed to be that brush, still waits, still carries whispers, still remembers. You're drifting now, hovering like a quiet ghost over muddy roads and flickering torchlight. The French army marches below, hundreds of boots stomping through Europe, cannons creaking, sabers rattling like dinner bells for the apocalypse. But even amid this grand machinery of conquest, there's a smaller, stranger item nestled in one of those supply wagons. Napoleon's toothbrush. Yes, it's still with him. Through snow, through mud, through the stink of thousands of soldiers sweating in wool and leather, it rides quietly in a lacquered box, lined with velvet. Not stored with the boots or bullets. No, this little item is wrapped in cloth, packed with cologne, flanked by razors and silver combs. It's practically royalty. The brush doesn't make history books, but it was there, right there, as French troops flooded across borders, setting fire to the maps of Europe. Napoleon, as always, kept it close. In every tent he set up, even those barely standing in the wind, There was a mirror, a water basin, and that faithful little grooming kit. Because whether he was leading a siege or drafting a new civil code, his teeth were never to be neglected. Imagine the absurdity. Cannonballs screaming past, horses rearing, messengers panting. And somewhere in the corner of a battlefield tent, Napoleon stands calmly, scrubbing away at his molars. That's not fantasy. That's detail. And history thrives in details. His valet, Constant, described it in passing. Not with fanfare, just a quiet note. The emperor would clean his teeth each morning, often with great focus. That's it. But that sentence opens a world. Because for a man like Napoleon, focus was everything. If he gave it to his teeth, you better believe he gave it to his enemies. Historians still argue whether this attention to hygiene came from health obsession or was simply routine, programmed habit. One theory suggests that Napoleon feared illness constantly. Germ theory wasn't fully established yet, but he was aware of contagion. Another theory says it was vanity, that Napoleon, ever self-aware, knew appearances mattered even in the mud. Whichever version you believe, the reality is this. While thousands suffered tooth decay, abscesses, and worse, Napoleon somehow kept his smile. His brush, with stiff pig hair bristles, wasn't comfortable. It wasn't soft, it scraped, it bled gums. But it worked. And you might be wondering, how does a toothbrush survive a campaign? Well, not easily. The bristles would fall out within weeks. The handle could snap. And battlefield conditions weren't exactly sterile. Yet, according to some accounts, Napoleon had multiple brushes. One for daily use, one for travel, one for ceremonial grooming. Yes, ceremonial. There are reports of him brushing right before meeting heads of state. Like a warrior preparing armor, only it was enamel instead of steel. And there is a deliciously weird detail buried in a Polish officer's diary from the 1807 campaign. He claimed to see Napoleon scold an aide for packing the wrong toothpaste. That's right, the wrong toothpaste. The entry reads, "He grew displeased and waved the jar at the man. 'This one numbs the tongue,' he snapped." Imagine storming Europe but refusing to tolerate subpar toothpaste. You chuckle quietly at the thought, the fire sound in your mind curling up around the scene like smoke. The man who reshaped France, squabbling about mint flavors. But it's in moments like these that he becomes real. Let's talk about that travel kit. It wasn't just a bag, it was a fortress of grooming. A custom-made chest, full of compartments for scissors, razors, colognes, even files for his nails. The toothbrush had its own slot, lined with silk, nestled beside a small metal tongue scraper. Yes, those existed even back then. In fact, Napoleon's personal travel case is on display today at Les Invalides in Paris, and replicas have been made by royal craftsmen. The brush isn't always included, but sketches show where it fit. One tiny rectangle among the gears of self-presentation. And oh, the gossip. See, soldiers started whispering. The closer you were to Napoleon's tent, the more you picked up on. His obsessive order, his morning rituals, the way he'd stare into the mirror with grim intensity, as if he were rehearsing a battle strategy on his own face. There is even a strange anecdote from a young lieutenant who claimed to hear the emperor humming while brushing. Not grand opera, not military marches, a lullaby, something soft and wordless, like a mother might hum to a child. Is that true? No one knows. But it's a beautiful image. Meanwhile, back in the chaos of army life, dental hygiene wasn't just rare. It was borderline heroic. Soldiers often lost teeth to scurvy, infection, or crude medical treatment. One cavalryman wrote home complaining that he couldn't chew hard biscuits because his molars had surrendered to the campaign. It was so bad that some soldiers were given soft bread as rations not because it was fresher, but because it wouldn't to break their teeth. And the ones who could brush? Improvised. They whittled sticks, used cloth, and rinsed with wine. So when rumors spread that the emperor had a real toothbrush and used it every day, it became a symbol of civilization, of French superiority, of class. Some men believed it gave him strength. Others mocked him for it, calling it a lady's tool. But the legend stuck, and with legends come imposters. At least 3 different merchants in Prussia and Italy claimed to sell Napoleon's campaign brush replicas, made of fake ivory, dipped in cheap perfume and priced absurdly high. They were scooped up by officers eager to mimic the master. By 1810, imperial toothbrushes were a minor black market item. Not exactly thrilling warfare, but lucrative hygiene. You smile softly at that. The idea that even amid swords and sabers, a toothbrush could become contraband. Here's another strange but true tidbit. One French general reportedly sent his toothbrush home in a sealed envelope before the Battle of Wagram. He feared he might not survive and wanted it kept as a relic. His wife wrote back, confused and slightly disgusted. "It still smells of mint," she said. "Do you wish me to worship it?" And it makes sense, because people were beginning to worship Napoleon, not just as a general, but as an icon. Every object he touched gained weight. A pen, a pair of boots, a hat, and yes, a toothbrush. Historians still debate whether the famous brush that turned up in Vienna years later, the one with gold inlay and initials carved in script, was real. Some say it was planted by collectors. Others believe it came from his Elba exile. We'll get to that. But for now, we're still deep in the march. Deep in the mud. Following a man who, no matter how much blood or glory surrounded him, always made time to brush. You're drifting closer to sleep now, but not quite there. Your mind floats beside a campfire. The stars overhead are soft and scattered. In the flickering light, you see him, Napoleon, seated on a camp stool, robe draped over his uniform, gently brushing in silence. Around him, the quiet murmur of soldiers winding down, writing letters, oiling muskets. But at the center, a man and a brush. He spits into a tin cup, rinses with water from a metal flask, dabs his mouth with cloth. And just like that, the emperor becomes a person. A man with morning breath, with sore gums, with a favorite brush that traveled farther than most people ever would. And as your eyes close just a bit more, you wonder, if you had held that brush, if you held it right now, would you feel anything? A spark? A whisper of command? Or just the chill of bone and the soft memory of mint? Either way, it would be enough. Because tonight, you've followed a bristle through borders, across rivers, into tents and memories, and myth. And the journey's only just begun. The wind howls across the mountains now, swirling through snow-covered peaks and scraping past the hooves of tired horses. You're there, in spirit, floating above the ice-slick stones of the great St. Bernard Pass. It's May of 1800. Napoleon is leading his army through the Alps, cold breath visible, soldiers bundled in cloaks, cannon wheels half buried in slush. And somewhere, beneath all this drama, tucked into a satchel hanging off the side of a white mule, is his toothbrush. Yes, it's still with him. It's wrapped tightly in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. Packed beside a flask of brandy, a comb, and his ever-present shaving tools. Because even while crossing one of the most treacherous mountain passes in Europe, Napoleon made sure his grooming kit wasn't left behind. That's the kind of man he was. When others packed extra boots or salted meat, he made room for hygiene. You glide now just behind him, watching as his heavy cloak flaps against the wind. His hat is pulled low, his face flushed with cold. His soldiers are near exhaustion, some without gloves, some without shoes. And yet the emperor moves forward, relentless, focused. This campaign, destined for Italy, is one of his most daring. One wrong step, One bad storm, and the entire French army could be swallowed by the mountains. And yet, every morning, as soon as he wakes inside a cramped wooden hut set up along the rocky trail, he performs the same quiet ritual. He brushes his teeth. With freezing fingers, he unwraps the brush. He dips it in melted snow warmed over a campfire. And he scrubs. Methodical. Careful. No flourish. No pomp. Just bristle against enamel, the cold sting of mint, and a man brushing away the weight of frost and history. Historians still argue whether this was pure discipline or something deeper. Maybe an anchor. A small act of control in a world spinning out of it. Because when you think about it, brushing your teeth in the middle of the Alps, while thousands of men freeze around you, isn't just dedication. It's a statement. It says, "Even here, I am emperor." And his men noticed. An aide wrote that he once saw Napoleon finish brushing, then immediately summoned 2 generals to plan a maneuver, all while dabbing his mouth with a clean cloth. He wiped his lips, the aide said, and drew battle lines in the dirt, from bristle to bayonet in less than 60 seconds. Classic Napoleon. And the toothbrush? This was no ordinary tool. This particular one, the Alpine brush, as some collectors call it, was smaller than usual. Portable. The handle was curved slightly, not for comfort, but to fit snugly in the travel kit's corner. The bristles were boar hair, thick and stiff, secured into drilled holes using brass wire. It was, by all accounts, a brutal little thing. Not designed for comfort, but for survival. There's a theory, slightly fringe, slightly wonderful, that Napoleon had this brush custom made, that a Paris craftsman designed it to match the curve of his jaw, that the bristle density was chosen based on his gum sensitivity. Is that true? No one can prove it. But somewhere in a dusty archive, there's a sketch of a toothbrush labeled Empereur Format Militaire, military format. And here's your quirky fact of the night. Some soldiers in Napoleon's army, inspired by his habits, began carving their own brushes out of bone and animal hair during the Alpine crossing. They'd use knife points to drill tiny holes, press in coarse hairs from horses' manes or even their own mustaches, and bind them together with twine or melted resin. They called them brosses de fortune, fortune brushes, handmade, hand-used, and often abandoned after the first rainstorm. Yet still, they tried. Because if the emperor could make time to brush, so could they. As you descend from the mountains, carried gently on the wind of memory, you find yourself back in warmth, back at the base camp. A fire crackles, steam rises from a bowl of hot water, and Napoleon, quiet and distant, sits in thought. The brush is resting beside him. His lips shine faintly from the oil in his toothpaste. Olive oil, camphor, crushed mint leaves. You and I might skip brushing after a red-eye flight. He didn't skip it after crawling over frozen death trails with artillery in tow. And perhaps that's why people followed him. Not because he was invincible, but because he appeared invincible. In command of himself, down to the last molar. Still, not everyone approved. Back in camp that evening, the story goes, Napoleon smiled. Just once, just faintly, and someone noticed. His teeth were gleaming. Now, as you lie there in the dark, letting the heat of your blanket hold you still, you start to feel it, this odd connection between self-care and power, between brushing and belief. Napoleon didn't just brush to clean, he brushed to be ready. For politics, for battle, for diplomacy, for history. And you? You're doing something similar. You're letting the world slow down. You're making space for comfort, for ritual, for quiet care. That's what this moment is. A brushstroke in the painting of your own history. So sleep now if you can. Drift gently. Let the brush keep going in your mind, up and down, side to side, like a metronome for dreams. Let it lead you past borders and into stories, where even the smallest tools carry the weight of greatness. Tonight the Alps are far away. The cannons are silent. The armies are gone. But one thing remains. A toothbrush, worn, familiar, powerful, and very possibly still waiting somewhere in a drawer, just like that shop in Paris. By now you know the sound of it. The soft scrape of bristles on enamel, the gentle hiss of breath through clenched teeth, the delicate clink of an ivory handle against a porcelain bowl. You've followed Napoleon's toothbrush from palace to pass, from velvet-lined boxes to frost-bitten mountain tops. But tonight, the bristles change. They grow weirder. Because hygiene in the 1800s wasn't just functional, it was experimental. And nowhere was that more true than in what actually made up the toothbrush. You're lying still, breathing slowly now, as we step into a quieter, more curious part of this story. The actual materials that might have made up Napoleon's toothbrush, or let's be honest, any number of his rumored 6 brushes. Some real, some fake, some just deliciously strange. Let's start with the most common material of the time, boar hair. That's right, the same animal that once snorted through underbrush in European forests also lent its wiry follicles to French dental hygiene. The hair was coarse, tough, and didn't last long. The bristles were usually harvested from the necks of boars, cleaned, sort of, then boiled to soften and sterilize them. Though the word sterilize might be generous. Now picture that. You're the Emperor of France, brushing your teeth with forest pig whiskers. Not quite the image his painters were commissioned to portray. But boar hair was just the start. Enter badger hair, slightly softer, slightly more expensive, and wildly popular among the British elite. Some believe Napoleon experimented with a badger hairbrush during his time in Egypt, brought to him as a gift by a British sympathizer or informant. Others think he found the bristles too soft. One aide reportedly quoted him muttering, "This brush caresses. I want a soldier, not a lover." And then we get stranger. Because during the early 1800s, some high-end toothbrushes were made with mouse hair. Yes, really. Mouse hair. Tiny, soft, fine, and extremely hard to collect. They were prized for their gentle texture, often used in brushes designed for people with sensitive gums or recent dental surgery. There's no record of Napoleon using a mouse hair brush himself, but one of his physicians, Dr. Corvisart, allegedly requested one during a gout flare-up that affected his jaw. It's unclear whether Napoleon was amused or disgusted, but he was curious. According to Constant, Napoleon's valet, the emperor liked to test products. He had samples sent from across the empire: soaps, oils, powders, brushes. He was very fond of novelty and small things, Constant wrote. Toothbrushes, especially. He once tried one made with crocodile leather for the handle. It fell apart within days. Now, that sounds ridiculous, until you remember that Napoleon also wore cologne that smelled faintly of rosemary and gunpowder. He wasn't afraid of a little oddity. Historians still argue whether his brush truly changed materials over the years, or whether these exotic variants were just gifts, collected and discarded like curiosities. But one thing is clear: the emperor had opinions. Let's talk about the paste. We've mentioned mint. We've mentioned camphor. But the recipes of early 19th century tooth powders are a chemistry lesson in madness. Common ingredients included crushed eggshells, charcoal bicarbonate of soda, powdered brick, burnt breadcrumbs, tobacco ash, and yes, sometimes soap. You picture it now. Napoleon dipping his brush into a little silver jar of what amounts to gritty, soapy gravel. The smell, sharp, herbal, almost medical. The taste, probably vile, but effective. Toothpaste as we know it didn't become widespread until decades later. Back then, you either made your own powder or bought it from a very suspect apothecary with jars that were never quite labeled the same way twice. And here's your quirky tidbit. One traveling dentist in northern France marketed a tooth-strengthening elixir that was 70% vinegar and 30% crushed oyster shell. He claimed it was tested on soldiers and horses. He later vanished under unclear circumstances, likely swallowed by his own marketing campaign. Napoleon, of course, had no patience for frauds. His physicians vetted everything. His tooth-cleaning routine, by all accounts, remained consistent. A sturdy bristle, a tin of reliable powder, a rinse of water or white wine, and a final dab of cologne around the lips. Because why not smell victorious? But let's pause here and go deeper, not just into the materials, but into the ritual. Because brushing, for Napoleon, wasn't an afterthought. It was a process. Every morning after a swift wash of the face, before breakfast or military briefings, he'd sit or stand before a small mirror. The brush, already prepared, would be unwrapped by Constant and handed over with a cloth. No one else touched his mouth, not even the valet. Napoleon insisted on brushing himself. Some said it was pride, others, superstition. But either way, this was his task, his moment. No aides, no generals, just bristles and breath. He would brush for 1 full minute, clocked, quiet, focused. Always starting with the front teeth, moving methodically side to side, before finishing with an upward stroke and a small rinse. Never too much water, never a long gargle. The emperor did not spit loudly, Constant noted. He found it undignified. It's a detail that makes you smile. Because even in a world of sabers and empire, Napoleon drew a line at noisy spitting. The brush would then be wiped clean, rinsed in warm water if available, and placed back in its designated velvet compartment. The toothpaste tin was sealed. The cloth was burned or boiled. Cleanliness was everything. And now, here's something that edges into the bizarre. One collector in modern-day Belgium claims to own one of Napoleon's discarded brushes. It's small, elegant, carved from ivory, with NB etched at the end. The bristles are long gone, but tiny traces remain inside the head, preserved in wax. In 2019, a DNA test was attempted on the bristle fragments. The results were inconclusive. Not enough usable material, but the shape of the handle, the style of engraving, and the provenance of the item all point to one thing: it's probably real. Historians still argue whether it was used daily or merely ceremonial, but either way, it carries the weight of possibility. A brush that passed through the hands of a man who held the fate of millions. Now you're floating, gently, above a quiet marble bathroom in the Tuileries Palace. The candles flicker. The basin is full. And there he is again, Napoleon. Shirt undone, sleeves rolled back, brushing slowly. Alone. The city sleeps beneath him. His empire hums outside the walls. But here, in this quiet room, it's just him. Flesh and bristles. You wonder what he's thinking. The Treaty of Amiens? His sister's scandalous affair? Or maybe absolutely nothing. Just the scratch of the brush. The comfort of the routine. That's the power of ritual. That's the peace of repetition. And it's the same rhythm you're falling into now. Your breath steady, your limbs warm, your thoughts brushing lightly against the edge of dreams. Let's not forget that Napoleon wasn't always Napoleon. Once, he was just a boy in Corsica, the son of a minor noble, a student, a soldier, a dreamer. And even then, there are hints, strange ones, that his attention to hygiene began early. One teacher noted that he was obsessed with personal neatness, that his boots were polished even when his uniform was torn, that he combed his hair meticulously, even under gunfire. So perhaps the toothbrush was never about wealth, never about status. Perhaps it was simply how he stayed anchored. Because for a man whose life moved constantly, from island to island, from battlefield to battlefield, this one little item never changed. Wood or ivory, boar or badger, charcoal or mint, It didn't matter. The brush was there. Every morning, every night, every corner of his restless empire. And that, dear listener, is how you know it mattered. It mattered enough to pack in snowstorms, to place in velvet, to gift to lovers, to scold aides over, to brush until blood, if needed. Because even the greatest conqueror the modern world had seen still had to fight plaque. And now, as your breath slows and your mind eases deeper into stillness, you can imagine it clearly. The final bristle, worn soft with years of use, curling like a question mark against time. A toothbrush. Simple, small, powerful, and utterly unforgettable. The air turns dry now, warmer. The faint scent of spice drifts on a breeze made of sand and smoke. You've followed Napoleon across mountains and into palaces, but tonight we descend into an older world. A stranger one. We're in Egypt. The year is 1798, and nestled in the folds of Napoleon's linen-packed luggage, tucked beside maps of the Nile and sketches of pyramids, is his toothbrush. Still traveling, still faithful. It has changed slightly, perhaps. Some say this was when he replaced his European brush with one modified for the desert. Shorter handle, thicker bristles. A cap made of brass to keep out sand. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain. The brush was with him. Because Napoleon brought everything to Egypt. Scientists, painters, scholars, engineers, even a printing press. His goal wasn't just military domination, it was intellectual conquest. He came to map the stars, to catalog the ancient ruins, to claim knowledge for France. But amid all that curiosity and chaos, hygiene didn't stop. And brushing? It remained sacred. Now imagine the scene. A tent pitched on scorched earth, moonlight pouring through thin fabric. In the center, a folding table, a mirror, a brass basin full of warm water heated over a coal stove, and beside it, his brush, ready for its nightly duty. He would have stood quietly, coat unbuttoned, eyes still carrying the glare of a desert sun, brushing while the wind dragged sand against canvas. And here is a curious twist. Napoleon's encounter with Egyptian hygiene would have changed the way he thought about brushing forever. Because while European elites were still rubbing chalk on their teeth, Egyptians had been cleaning theirs with miswak for centuries. A natural chewing stick from the Salvadora persica tree, miswak was both toothbrush and toothpaste in one. Rich in fluoride, antibacterial compounds, and astringent oils, it had been used across the Islamic world for generations. And Napoleon noticed. He saw his guides and translators using miswak, snapping off small twigs, peeling the bark, chewing one end into a brush-like fray, and scrubbing their teeth with practiced ease. No powder, no paste, just wood and breath. Accounts differ on how he reacted. Some say he was impressed. Others claim he tried one, spat, and muttered, "Tastes like the inside of a camel." But historians still argue whether Napoleon incorporated miswak into his personal grooming. There is a French sketch dated 1799, showing what looks suspiciously like a travel case with both a European toothbrush and a miswak stick beside it. The label reads, "Curiosité d'Orient, usage de l'empereur." Whether he used it daily or not, one thing is certain. He was fascinated, because Napoleon believed in utility. If something worked, he adopted it. Uniform styles, engineering ideas, battlefield tactics. Even the concept of military ambulances came from a system he witnessed in Egypt. Why not dental tools? And here is your fringe fact. A French surgeon accompanying the expedition wrote in his journal that Napoleon requested an analysis of miswak as chemical makeup. The surgeon, poor man, boiled sticks into paste and tested them on volunteer soldiers. His verdict? Earthy, bitter, but oddly effective. Of course, none of that stopped the campaign from going sideways. Despite early victories, Egypt proved difficult. Disease spread fast. The heat was unrelenting. Supplies dwindled. And in the ancient city of Cairo, surrounded by relics of empires long gone, Napoleon found himself staring at ruins older than memory. One night, according to a scholar traveling with him, Napoleon stood alone near a temple wall, his brush still wet in his hand. The scholar wrote, "He seemed distracted. He brushed absently, then stopped, turned, and said, 'Do you think Caesar brushed?' It was a strange question, but a revealing one, because it meant something was shifting in him. Surrounded by pharaohs' tombs and statues with chipped smiles, Napoleon was thinking about legacy, about what would be left behind, about what small things might survive. He was beginning to imagine himself as part of history, not just a maker of it. And maybe, just maybe, that toothbrush in his hand, white handle gleaming under torchlight, felt suddenly fragile, too ordinary to matter, too personal to forget. You lie still now, blanket soft against your arms, eyes heavier, as the fire sound in your mind crackles into embers. You picture yourself in the Egyptian desert, reclining under a linen awning, watching the emperor brush as camels grunt nearby. The sand shifts around you. Time feels slower, more golden, more ancient. But not everything was majestic. Because let's be real, Egypt in 1798 was also gross. People bathed infrequently. Flies were relentless. Water was scarce. And the French soldiers? Most of them didn't bring toothbrushes. They improvised with rags, with river water, with bits of linen dipped in wine. Some officers used ash mixed with lemon peel. Others just gave up. One French captain wrote, "My breath could spoil olives, but I still salute the sun." Napoleon, though? He stayed clean. At least, as clean as circumstances allowed. He brushed when others wilted. He shaved while others collapsed. One story claims that after a particularly grueling battle near Alexandria, while his troops lay unconscious from heat exhaustion, Napoleon rose before dawn and insisted on brushing before breakfast. Not because he had the energy, but because he refused to start the day dirty. Some say it was stubbornness, others say it was strategy. Because here's something to ponder as you drift further into quiet. Ritual creates identity. And in a world where everything changes, climate, terrain, politics, loyalty, the toothbrush remained constant. A small act, a firm reminder, a quiet rebellion against decay. Back in Europe, rumors started to circulate about Napoleon's Egyptian grooming, that he wore Egyptian robes, that he bathed in rose water, that he brushed with sticks soaked in honey. Most of it was nonsense, of course, but it didn't matter. The image had taken root. Napoleon, half king, half mystic, keeping his teeth white in the land of sand. And there's another wrinkle, one few people talk about. Mummies. Yes, you heard me, because as part of Napoleon's scholarly expedition, his scientists opened several tombs. They cataloged ancient remains, measured skulls, studied embalming techniques. And they noticed something eerie. Many of the mummies had remarkably preserved teeth. Not pearly white, no, but solid, intact, rarely missing. This fascinated Napoleon. There's a documented evening discussion, recorded by his savants, where the topic of ancient dental care came up. One professor suggested that the Egyptians' coarse bread and plant-based diets kept their teeth clean. Another argued that the embalming process just preserved whatever was left. But Napoleon, he simply said, "They did not rot. That is victory." It was a strange thing to say, but not meaningless, because for him, rot was the enemy. Of flesh, of empire, of memory. And perhaps that's why he brushed so obsessively. Not just to stay clean, but to avoid the slow fade of time, to remain intact, unspoiled, like a mummy with a crown. You smile softly at that. It's ridiculous, and also kind of beautiful. Because at the center of every great man is a small vanity, a refusal to let the world wear him down. And if that means dragging a toothbrush through the desert, then so be it. Napoleon left Egypt under complicated terms, defeated technically, but still wrapped in myth. He returned to France not just as a general, but as a living legend. And the toothbrush? Still with him. Same box, same brush, same routine. Back to the land of cologne and candles. Back to velvet chairs and marble floors. But he was changed. He had seen empires buried in sand. He had brushed beside pyramids. And maybe, just maybe, he had started to wonder what parts of his story would survive. And you, listener, are proof that it worked. Because here you are, centuries later, tucked in, eyes nearly closed, listening not to his battles, but to the brush he carried. Because in the end, it's not always the noise that survives. Sometimes it's the quiet habits, the bristles, the breath, the silence between victories. So sleep now. You're safe. You're still. And tomorrow, when you pick up your own brush, remember this. You're part of a very strange, very beautiful tradition. Napoleon knew it, and now so do you. The waves roll gently now, rising and falling beneath a pale gray sky. You're not quite on land anymore. You're drifting, quietly, across the English Channel. The sea is cold, but calm, steady, like a heartbeat slowed by exhaustion. It's 1815. Napoleon's empire is collapsing. The final embers of his rule flicker in the wind. And somewhere, in the baggage of his retreat, still packed, still present, is that familiar brush, ivory, worn. Bristles frayed from years of use. The toothpaste tin almost empty, but still there. You can almost feel the tension in the air. His world, once sprawling across continents, has shrunk to a handful of trunks and loyal aides. One last uniform, one last horse, one last desperate escape. And amid it all, the toothbrush travels with him. Not out of luxury, but out of habit. Out of some deep need to maintain the ritual, even as the walls close in. This is where the story twists. Because from this point forward, we're not just following a brush through private routines, we're following it through capture, confiscation, and maybe theft. Because after the Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon finally surrendered to the British, something peculiar happened. The British Navy took possession of his belongings. All of them. His sword, his personal letters, his spare gloves, his grooming kit. And yes, his toothbrush. There's a detailed inventory, still preserved in naval archives, listing the items seized aboard the HMS Bellerophon, the ship that carried him across the Channel in defeat. The list includes a toilette set of continental origin, and among its items, a small ivory-handled implement for dental maintenance. That's official British inventory speak for, yep, they took the man's toothbrush. Historians still argue whether it was the same brush that traveled through Italy, across the Alps, into Egypt, and back, or whether it was a new one, perhaps hastily packed in the final moments of collapse. But either way, it became a trophy. A strange one. A private one. But a trophy, nonetheless. Because here is the truth no one likes to say out loud. The British were obsessed with Napoleon, even as they defeated him, even as they exiled him, even as they mocked him in newspapers and laughed at cartoons showing him as a short, tantrum-prone child. They couldn't stop collecting him. And the toothbrush? It was personal, a symbol of intimacy, of daily life, of the man behind the myth. One naval officer reportedly asked to keep it as a memento. Another wanted to send it to a museum. But in the end, it disappeared from the records. Just gone. Some say it was gifted to a British nobleman. Others claim it was smuggled into London and sold quietly to a collector. And then, there's the most intriguing theory of all, that the brush was taken home by a cabin boy. A young sailor who, after cleaning the emperor's cabin, found the brush tucked into a corner, and rather than log it officially, he slipped it into his coat pocket. Just a keepsake, nothing more. He later told his grandchildren he had Napoleon's brush in a drawer for 50 years. They never found it, but the story remained. Now you're adrift in this uncertainty, floating between rumor and record, between the British officer's log and the sailor's bedtime tale. Somewhere, in the folds of both, the truth lingers. It wouldn't be the first time a small item disappeared into history, and yet the British did keep one piece of Napoleon's grooming kit, his razor. It's on display today at the National Maritime Museum. A slim, elegant blade with a curved ivory handle, marked "Used by Bonaparte aboard the Bellerophon." So if the razor made it, why not the brush? Here is your quirky tidbit for the night. One British general wrote in a letter that Napoleon's grooming habits aboard the ship were meticulous, if not obsessive. He shaved daily, paced, asked for fresh water constantly, and, yes, brushed every morning at precisely the same time. Even as a prisoner, even with his empire gone, even while begging for asylum, he still brushed. Because what else could he do? Imagine it, the cabin small and damp, creaking with every wave. Napoleon seated at a folding desk using a chipped mirror, his reflection not quite centered, his boots unpolished, his future uncertain, but his teeth? Still clean, still defended, still his. And this is where the story becomes haunting. Because what is brushing in the end, if not defiance? You lose your crown. You lose your country. You lose your title. But you don't lose your brush. Not until they take it from you. And even then, you imagine it, sitting silently in someone else's drawer, a ghost of a gesture, a reminder that even emperors have molars. The British obsession with Napoleon didn't stop at the brush. Soon, artists were painting him aboard the ship, sketching him in exile. Writers were publishing memoirs of brief encounters. Even commoners lined up in ports, hoping for a glimpse of the defeated man through the rigging. But few, if any, thought about the items that traveled with him. The slippers, the pillow, the soap, the comb, and that little brush. Ivory, stained at the base, worn at the top, but real, tangible, gone now, and yet not forgotten. Because here you are, centuries later, imagining it, reconstructing its path, tracing the bristles through campaigns, palaces, deserts, oceans, and finally, a locked British drawer. There's one more layer to this mystery. A small museum in Wiltshire, England, claims to own a Napoleon toothbrush. Not the toothbrush, mind you, just a Napoleon toothbrush. They keep it behind glass. The bristles are long gone. The ivory is cracked. The story is vague. They admit it might be a replica. But people still visit, still press their faces to the glass, still whisper, could it be real? Because it's not really about proof. It's about belief, about the strange comfort we get from knowing that someone so powerful, so untouchable, still had to wake up, grab a brush, and scrape the taste of sleep from his mouth. Same as you, same as me, same as anyone. You settle deeper now, your breath sinking with the slow rhythm of the waves. The story floats beside you, soft, salty, unfinished. You feel the creak of the ship's floorboards beneath your back, the soft splash of water against wood. You're there, aboard the Bellerophon, in the cabin, in the silence between collapse and exile. And the brush? Still waiting, still holding its secrets, still bristling with the ghost of empire. Because some things, no matter how ordinary, carry the weight of myth. And a toothbrush, handled daily, packed carefully, brushed quietly across teeth that once shouted orders heard across nations, might just be the most powerful, same as anyone. You settle deeper now, your breath sinking with the slow rhythm of the waves. The story floats beside you, soft, salty, unfinished. You feel the creak of the ship's floorboards beneath your back, the soft splash of water against wood. You're there, aboard the Bellerophon, in the cabin, in the silence between collapse and exile. And the brush? Still waiting, still holding its secrets, still bristling with the ghost of empire. Because some things, no matter how ordinary, carry the weight of myth. And a toothbrush, handled daily, packed carefully, brushed quietly across teeth that once shouted orders heard across nations, might just be the most powerful object of all. The waves are behind you now. The roar of the English Channel fades to a whisper. Your breath slows, matching the rhythm of a softer sea, a smaller shore. You've landed on Elba. The year is 1814. Napoleon has abdicated for the first time. He's no longer emperor of the French, but now, oddly, emperor of this tiny Mediterranean island. And yes, the toothbrush is here too. You can almost hear it, resting quietly in his new chamber. It's wrapped in cloth, placed beside his razor and soap, same as ever. Not packed away, not forgotten, still present, still performing its quiet duty. Because even in exile, especially in exile, Napoleon maintained his rituals. His new palace on Elba wasn't exactly Versailles. It was modest, the ceilings lower, the walls humbler. The view, however, spectacular. Hills, vineyards, a glittering sea that stretched endlessly toward France. And in this strange little bubble, with fewer guards and far fewer distractions, Napoleon continued brushing, as if nothing had changed. Every morning, every night, without fail. Even now, he kept the timing exact. His valet, still constant, described how Napoleon would wake before the sun, wash with a damp cloth, and then reach automatically for his toothbrush. Same strokes, same careful rinse, same silence. It was one of the few things that didn't change. And maybe that was the point. Because here, stripped of ceremony, stripped of audience, there were no crowds to impress, no officers to mimic him, no generals to outdiscipline. He was brushing not for them, but for himself. Or maybe just to keep his identity intact. Historians still argue whether Napoleon accepted his exile gracefully or plotted escape from day one. But there's agreement on this. He never allowed himself to decay. His uniform stayed pressed, his boots polished, and his teeth still brushed. Here is your fringe detail of the night. Napoleon reportedly requested a second toothbrush be sent from the mainland while on Elba. A backup. This suggests he feared losing the one he had, or simply knew it was wearing out. You imagine him holding the old brush up to the window, inspecting the bristles in Mediterranean light, running a finger along the cracked ivory, frowning slightly. The same man who once measured artillery angles with mathematical precision, now studying frayed bristles with equal scrutiny. And perhaps the most human moment in all this comes from a short note found among his correspondence on Elba. It's just one line, likely dictated to an aide. Send more powder. Mint, not ash. That's it. No military code, no secret message. Just a man who still cared about the taste in his mouth. Because when you're rebuilding your life, even one the world believes is over, you start with small comforts. And brushing? It's not just about cleanliness. It's about rhythm, continuity, control. In his early weeks on Elba, Napoleon kept a tight schedule. He reorganized the island's administration, planted new gardens, took long rides through olive groves. But no matter how the day unfolded, the brushing remained a fixed point. Imagine it. Late afternoon. The sun low. Napoleon seated by a window, shirt collar open. A small basin on the table. His hand lifts. The brush begins its slow, repetitive journey. Back and forth, like a clock still ticking in a world trying to forget him. He wasn't forgotten, of course. Elba was small, but the rumors were vast. Locals whispered about the emperor's grooming habits, how he smelled of sandalwood, how he never sweated, how his teeth were impossibly white. Some even claimed he enchanted his toothbrush. Ridiculous, of course, but a perfect example of how mystery clings to the mundane. And here is your quirky tidbit. A British officer visiting Elba under diplomatic pretense reported that Napoleon carried his toothbrush in a velvet pouch embroidered with gold thread. Whether this is fact or embellishment, it paints the picture perfectly. This was not just a tool, it was a relic, a brush fit for an emperor, even a fallen one. Now let's drift deeper. You're in his private chamber at dusk. The fireplace glows gently. A single candle flickers. Napoleon is seated in thought. Before him, the brush. He reaches for it slowly, as if savoring the moment. Not rushing, not performing, just being. The room is quiet save for the scratch of bristles and the gentle swirl of sea wind through an open shutter. He pauses occasionally, not because he's finished, but because he's remembering. Each stroke a memory, a campaign, a city, a face. Because brushing in exile becomes more than hygiene. It becomes meditation. And there's something beautiful in that, isn't there? When the empire falls away, when the cannons go quiet, when the maps are folded and the flags are burned, what's left? A man, a hand, a brush, and a moment of peace. As time passed on Elba, Napoleon's habits became legend among the islanders. Children claimed he walked with perfect posture. Farmers whispered that he could summon the wind. But always, someone mentioned how clean he looked, how polished his presence remained, and they weren't wrong, because that toothbrush, used, packed, used again, was a symbol, not of vanity, but of resistance. The empire may be gone, Napoleon seemed to say, but I am not undone. And then, after just 10 months, came the escape. We won't dive too deeply into the 100 days here. That chapter awaits you later in this story. But for now, imagine the rush, the plans, the secret departure, the boat waiting in moonlight, and tucked into a side satchel, zipped behind maps and coins, the brush. He brought it with him. Of course he did. Because when you retake the world, you don't start unbrushed. One aide described the morning of departure as eerily calm. Napoleon dressed in silence, ate a single fig, brushed his teeth, then stepped onto the boat as if it were a royal staircase. That image stays with you now. The emperor, brushed, ready, unyielding, sailing once again toward history. And as your breath softens, as your body grows heavier under the covers, that image becomes dreamlike. Not just Napoleon, but you, stepping into the unknown with small rituals intact. Because sometimes survival isn't about armies. It's about brushing your teeth in the dark and daring the world to keep going. The sea is calm again. The sails are full. The sun is rising. And in the folds of Napoleon's coat, the brush sits quietly, waiting for the next moment, the next mirror, the next day, still faithful, still bristling, still Napoleon. The clouds are low, heavy, not quite rain, not quite sky. The earth beneath your feet feels damp, softened by days of drizzle. Somewhere in the distance, boots churn mud into memory. The air smells like gunpowder, wet leather, and something older. Defeat, waiting. It's June 18th, 1815, Waterloo. And yes, he brought the toothbrush. Of course he did. The man who crossed the Alps with it, who brushed in tents and under torches, who carried it through palaces, across deserts, and into exile. He wasn't about to leave it behind now. You can picture it. Still in its worn travel pouch, wrapped in cloth, its bristles a little more frayed, its handle faintly stained from years of use. Nestled beside razors and gloves, tucked away in a weathered satchel that no longer looked like it belonged to an emperor. And yet, even as everything else began to crumble, alliances, formations, morale. That small ivory brush held its ground. Constant, his ever-loyal valet, had packed it carefully that morning, along with Napoleon's gray greatcoat, the famous one, the coat of legends. And yes, the brush rode in the same bag. That's the sort of detail you don't find in most history books. But you can feel it now, because that morning wasn't cinematic. It was slow, muddy, cold, the kind of morning that seeps into bone. And before orders were shouted and cannon fire began, before the first of tens of thousands of men took position, Napoleon stood in a field tent, brushing his teeth. It was part of the ritual. The same rhythm, the same scratch and rinse. Not because he expected to win, but because he refused to surrender the morning. Even as the world narrowed to a muddy field in Belgium, historians still argue whether Napoleon believed he would win that day. Some say he felt fate turning. Others believe he was overconfident, blinded by years of triumph. But no one disputes this. He carried himself with calm. And calm, for him, began with a toothbrush. A French officer watching from just outside the tent later wrote, "He was brushing, silent, not quickly. The same as always, as if it were any day." Imagine that. Outside, Wellington's forces gather. Prussian troops approach from the east. The clock ticks toward disaster. And Napoleon? Still scraping mint and fatigue from his teeth. That's not delusion. That's a man insisting, just for one more day, that he remains himself. And here is your quirky fact. The battlefield mud at Waterloo was so deep and wet that some soldiers claimed it pulled boots from their feet. One general reportedly slipped and fell face first into it before delivering an order. But even in that muck, Napoleon's valet made sure the grooming kit stayed dry. The brush never touched the ground. Not once. The battle, of course, did not go well. Rain the night before had soaked the fields. Cannons misfired. Horses stumbled. Communications broke down. The enemy held. By afternoon, Napoleon was struggling, not just with strategy, but with his own body. His health was failing. Some said it was stomach pain. Others hinted at exhaustion. He rode less than usual. He remained seated longer. And always that tight, familiar frown. You can almost hear the internal monologue. Hold the right flank. Delay the Prussians. Trust Ney. Don't let them see the pain. But pain has a way of making itself known, especially when the air is filled with smoke and the horizon's on fire. And through it all, the brush remained packed, untouched, in a bag near the emperor's tent. At some point that day, likely late afternoon, Napoleon changed clothes. He removed his coat, washed his face, and it's very likely, in the chaos, the brush was moved. By Constant? By another aide? We don't know. But this is where the mystery begins. Because after Waterloo, after the lines broke, after the French fled, after the last cannon went quiet, Napoleon disappeared into retreat. And the brush? It vanished. There is no record of it being packed again after the battle. No mention in the frantic journal entries or the crumpled inventories drawn up in the hours and days that followed. Only silence. Gone. And that makes it perfect. Because Waterloo was the undoing of everything Napoleon had built. The final unthreading. And so, fittingly, the toothbrush disappears in the noise. Some believe it was taken, snatched by a looter who stormed the camp. Others think it was abandoned, crushed underfoot, lost in the churned earth of a collapsing empire. But a few, just a few, believe it was taken by a British officer. There's a diary, faint, faded, written by a junior officer from the King's German Legion. In it, he describes walking through the empty French encampment after victory. Found coins, maps, utensils, a brush, possibly his, ivory, strange shape, kept it. That's all it says. No confirmation, no provenance. Just one line, one brush. But if true, that would make it the final witness. The brush that felt the hand of a man who changed the world, and then watched the world change him back. It's poetic. Too poetic, maybe, but that's history for you. A little truth, a little mud, and just enough imagination to keep it alive. You close your eyes now, letting that field fall silent. The horses are gone. The gunfire is gone. Even the clouds have lifted. All that remains is one bag, one brush, and one man, seated, shoulders heavy, wondering how it all slipped away. And yet, even in that moment of loss, you imagine him brushing again. Later, somewhere quiet. Not for strategy, not for show, but because it was the one act no one could take from him. One last detail before sleep pulls you closer. A small artifact sits in a drawer in a private collection in Brussels. It's a toothbrush. Old, ivory, worn. The collector claims it came from the battlefield, passed down through 5 generations. No engraving, no initials, just history soaked into the grain. He doesn't display it, doesn't boast about it, but he keeps it clean. And sometimes, just sometimes, he brushes with it. A strange kind of tribute, a soft reenactment, a reminder that greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just scrubs quietly. Once, twice, rinse, repeat, and disappears. The battle is over now. The field at Waterloo is still silent. What once rang with cannon blasts and horse cries now lies heavy beneath a blanket of smoke and silence. You drift gently forward, not through the carnage, but through time. A day has passed, then 2, then a week. Napoleon is in flight, his armies scattered, his hopes dimmed to embers. And you? You're following a different trail, a quieter one. Not Napoleon himself this time, but his things, his coat, his hat, his letters, his silver, and yes, potentially the brush. Because even as Napoleon's legend was crumbling in real time, the mythology of his possessions was only beginning to rise. Enter Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Victorious, stoic, detail-oriented. The man who stood firm as Napoleon faltered. The man who accepted surrender without a roar, but with a nod. And perhaps the man who ended up with one very unusual drawer. You see, after the battle, Wellington's staff gathered what was left behind. Some items were claimed as trophies. Others were sent back to London for cataloguing. A few were quietly pocketed, never logged. But one satchel made its way, unlabeled, half-torn, to Wellington's private estate, Stratfield Saye House. It arrived in a trunk containing battlefield memorabilia, a French insignia, a broken sword, a crumpled note in Napoleon's own hand, and tucked into one corner, a small wrapped bundle containing grooming tools. Among them, according to whispered household records, an ivory-handled toothbrush. No inscription, no label, but carefully preserved. It wasn't displayed, wasn't listed in any formal archive. It lived in a drawer, a quiet, strange drawer, in the Duke's private study. The room itself was like a war general's mind. Sharp edges, clean lines, not much sentiment. Books, maps, a telescope. But the drawer in question? That was different. It held odds and ends, bits of leather, a dried rose, the brush. And if the story is to be believed, Wellington never mentioned it aloud. Not once. Why would he? This wasn't a medal or a musket. It wasn't a painting or a prize. It was personal. A toothbrush, still lightly scented with camphor when first opened. Bristles stiff, handle discolored from use. And here's the thing. It was used. Just a few times. Not by Napoleon, obviously. By Wellington. According to the housekeeper's granddaughter, who recorded oral histories from her grandmother, he brushed with it exactly 3 times. Then he set it aside, placed it back in the drawer, closed it, and never opened it again. Was it out of curiosity, morbid fascination, a psychological victory ritual? Historians still argue whether the entire tale is apocryphal. Some say it's pure family myth. Others point to notes scribbled in a servant's ledger. General study, drawer 2, ends brush, not to be moved. Let that settle for a moment. Not to be moved. Why? Because maybe, even for the man who defeated him, Napoleon's toothbrush held a strange kind of gravity. A relic, not of war, but of routine, of humanity. Because what is a battlefield but an explosion of chaos? And what is a toothbrush but the opposite? Order, repetition, intention. The idea that even in exile, even in loss, a man can still draw circles across his own teeth and feel like something is in his control. Maybe Wellington understood that. Maybe that's why he never displayed it. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a warning. It was a window. And sometimes, windows are best left closed. You float now through that study. The house long since converted to a museum. Visitors come for the portraits, the uniforms, the swords, but not for the drawer. That drawer sits quietly, locked, forgotten. But sometimes, just sometimes, a curator opens it, gently, reverently, and there it is, still lying on its cloth, still real, still humming with the memory of two men who shaped the world, one who used it, and one who, perhaps, understood why. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. During a renovation in the 1980s, a historian stumbled upon an unlabeled object in a velvet-lined tray, a toothbrush. No case, no tag, just placed gently on faded cloth. He asked the curator about it. She said, "Oh, that's the drawer thing. Some say it belonged to Boney. Others say Wellington brushed with it once and hated the taste. The brush has since disappeared again, moved, archived, or quietly removed from public view. No one will confirm its location. Perhaps because it's too ridiculous to take seriously, or perhaps because it's too real to ignore. And that's the thing about history. Sometimes it's the loud moments, the gunfire, the coronations that get all the glory. But it's the quiet ones that linger. One man brushing beside a battlefield. Another man brushing in victory. Both alone, both thinking. Both brushing away blood and breath and memory. And neither able to forget. Because the toothbrush was never just a tool. It was a connection. To the mundane, to the mortal. To the morning routines that endure even when empires don't. You're drifting now. Heavy-limbed. Thoughtful. The fireplace in your mind has settled to coals. The night presses gently at the edges of your awareness. And somewhere, in a drawer older than dust, a brush still waits. Its bristles quiet, its handle warm from long ago hands, and its story far from over. The world has moved on. Napoleon is gone now, exiled again, this time for good. A rock in the Atlantic called St. Helena swallowed him into its misty silence. And even there, yes, even there, he brushed his teeth. We'll return to that later. For now, we step into a different kind of room. No longer war tents, no more damp ships or palace chambers. This place smells of polish and ink. Velvet ropes line the walls. A gavel waits beside a mustachioed man with a pocket watch and a clear throat. Welcome to Victorian London, the auction capital of empire. And guess what just came up for sale? That's right, a toothbrush. Ivory handle. Supposed French origin. Accompanied by a yellowed note in copperplate script reading, said to have belonged to Bonaparte. Acquired 1815, Waterloo Field. Starting bid, 15 shillings. You blink, because it's absurd, isn't it? A toothbrush, on display like a crown jewel. People crowding to see it. Women holding fans over flushed faces. Gentlemen adjusting monocles. And yet, there's a kind of poetry to it. Napoleon changed the shape of Europe. And now, his toothbrush is changing hands. The year is 1852, almost 30 years since his death, and the world is hungry. For him, for his memory, his memorabilia, his myth. Statues are going up, portraits reprinted, coins minted. His nephew is now Emperor of France. The Bonaparte name lives again. And anything linked to the original Napoleon is worth its weight in sentiment and silver. This is where the legend of the toothbrush really takes flight. Because suddenly they're everywhere. Auction catalogs list Napoleonic brushes with wild confidence. Some ivory, some bone. One, allegedly, gold-plated with emerald inlay, likely false. They appear in Parisian curio shops, in private estate sales, even in letters between gentlemen collectors. Acquired Bonaparte's own, one writes. Fine bristle, slight mint residue. Obtained from a Belgian trooper, says another. Still bears the scent of camphor. A finer relic I've never held. But here's the problem. There are too many. By 1870, at least 11 brushes have been claimed as Napoleon's. 11, and the emperor, for all his glory, did not carry a grooming boutique with him on campaign. At most, 2, maybe 3. So what happened? Simple. The Victorians fell in love with the idea of Napoleon's toothbrush. Not the object, but the image of it. The absurdity, the intimacy, the contradiction. This was the man who crowned himself emperor, who marched 1 million men across Europe, who made kings kneel, and yet had to scrub his gums like everyone else. They loved that. It humanized him. It made him collectible. And so fakes began to flood the market. You're standing now in one of those auction houses, the air thick with dust and excitement. A brush rests on red velvet. The auctioneer raises a white-gloved hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he says, we begin with lot 23, the dental implement of a sovereign. The room murmurs. Bidding begins. And someone, somewhere, wins the lot for a week's wages. They'll display it proudly on a mantel, whisper to guests over brandy, and no one will ever be sure if it's real. Because that's the strange magic of relics. They don't have to be proven. They just have to feel true. You might think this cheapens the story, that the dignity of Napoleon's life is tarnished by a dozen imitation toothbrushes. But here's a softer way to see it. They're love letters, tiny, ridiculous love letters to a man who loomed so large, people clung to even his imagined bristles. The British weren't alone in this. In Paris, too, the fever caught on. Antique shops in the Marais began offering imperial brushes, usually bone or horn, sometimes with initials etched in shaky cursive. One vendor claimed his came from Napoleon's tooth servant, a job that never existed. In Vienna, a museum displayed a brush said to have been seized during the 1809 campaign. It had 3 bristles left, a cracked handle, and a plaque that read, "From the mouth of power." And in New York City, yes, even across the Atlantic, a wealthy collector boasted of owning a Bonaparte grooming set. Whether it included a toothbrush is unknown, but a visitor noted that it smelled faintly of mint and must. That's the thing about myths. They travel, they multiply, and they're hard to brush away. By the late 19th century, Napoleon's toothbrush had become something else entirely. Not a hygiene tool, not even a keepsake. It was the punchline of a historical obsession. Cartoons appeared in newspapers. Napoleon brushing before charging into battle. Napoleon brushing while exiling himself. Napoleon brushing in full military regalia, declaring, "I conquer plaque." One satirical poem from 1888 reads, "He brushed at dawn, he brushed at night. With bristles stiff and ivory white. He fought the world and held it tight. But still he flossed before a fight." It's funny, but also sweet, because what they were really saying was, he mattered. Even his toothbrush mattered. And it still does. Here's your quirky tidbit. One British aristocrat, Lady Arabella Greenway, reportedly had a set of napkin rings carved from a piece of ivory she claimed came from Napoleon's toothbrush handle. Were they? Probably not. But guests used them reverently, quietly, as if every roast beef dinner came with a side of imperial drama. So now you understand. The brush wasn't just an artifact, it was a portal into a past people couldn't let go of. And in a way, who can blame them? Napoleon lived like fire, fast, bright, dangerous, and like fire he left behind strange little ashes. Some of them wore medals, some of them sat in museum drawers, and some of them had bristles. You lie back now, letting your breathing match the soft tick of a grandfather clock echoing in your mind. A Victorian parlor fades around you. The fire dims, the crowd clears. But the brush remains, sitting in a glass case, still, still, still. And somewhere, tucked into a collector's catalog, a page reads, Lot 23. Toothbrush, possibly Bonaparte's. Provenance uncertain. Story rich. Value subjective. And that perhaps is the most honest assessment of all. Because in the end, it's not about the object. It's about what we need it to be. A joke, a tribute, a bedtime story, or just something small and soft and very human. In the middle of all that war, the velvet ropes are newer now. The glass is stronger. The lighting, cleaner. You've wandered forward through time again, past battlefields, auction houses, and Victorian drawing rooms, until at last, you're here, in a modern-day museum, somewhere quiet, polished, full of the hush of footfalls and gentle, reverent whispers. There's soft lighting on brass nameplates, audio guides in multiple languages, cameras watching from the ceiling, and a gift shop waiting patiently near the exit. But you're not here for postcards. You're here for something older, stranger, something so absurd, so oddly specific, that most people don't even notice it on their first visit. You follow the signs, Napoleonic memorabilia, then personal effects of empire. Around a corner, behind a pane of glass, lies a small, simple display. And inside, a toothbrush, ivory handle, no visible initials, a little too perfect. The plaque reads, Toothbrush, claimed to be Napoleon Bonaparte's. Early 19th century French craftsmanship. Origin disputed. You stand there for a long moment, looking. Not because you're convinced this brush touched Napoleon's molars, but because someone, somewhere, wants you to believe it might have. And that's what this entire room is built on. Possibility. This is where our story slows down. On the cold, tiled floor of a museum hallway, where memory has been pinned to corkboard and framed in glass. Because by now, hundreds of items have been tagged as Napoleon's. His boots, his watch, his gloves, his hat. Oh, the hat gets around. But the toothbrush? It remains the most debated of all. Why? Because it's just so personal, so humble, and yet, if real, it's the most viscerally intimate item he ever used. No brush can fake that. But oh, many have tried. There's a whole genre of these imposters now. Objects that look right, feel right, have just enough wear and just enough myth attached to make them seem real. Some are deliberate forgeries. Others are just victims of wishful thinking passed down through families who want to believe. Museum curators? They've seen it all. You're drifting now into a back office, not on display. The door says, Collections and Conservation. Inside, metal drawers, acid-free tissue, cold fluorescent lights, and on a tray lined with soft gray felt, another toothbrush, similar to the one outside, a little more aged, bristles mostly gone. It came in with no paperwork, no provenance, just a handwritten note from 1937. Recovered from St. Helena, said to be Bonaparte's, from trunk of Dr. Arnott. Dr. Arnott was one of the physicians who attended Napoleon in his final days on St. Helena. That's real. But the toothbrush? We don't know. There are no letters mentioning it, no entries in Arnott's records, no matching brush in earlier inventories. And so, it waits. Labeled unconfirmed, tucked into storage like a patient on standby. You might think it's sad that this brush, if it is Napoleon's, now sits untouched, uncertain, unseen. But maybe not. Maybe it's safer here, in silence, in cool, archival calm, away from the auctions, the jokes, the hands of collectors who might drop it, or worse, clean it. Because if this is the real one, it doesn't need to prove anything anymore. It's done its job, it's survived, and you've seen it now, felt its ghost. And in a way, that's enough. But let's entertain the other side. Let's talk about the hoaxes, because they're just as interesting. In 1999, a small museum in Italy claimed to have located the true Napoleon toothbrush inside the estate of an eccentric noblewoman. The handle was gold. The bristles were supposedly horsehair. And the whole thing was kept in a velvet-lined case, stamped with the Napoleonic eagle. Sounds convincing. But then came the red flags. For one, gold is far too soft for a toothbrush handle. It would bend, warp, and corrode with any real use. For another, the bristles were attached with a synthetic glue developed in the 1880s, long after Napoleon's death. And the biggest giveaway? The case lining was machine-stitched. By the time historians were finished with their analysis, the brush had been downgraded to replica of uncertain date, likely created for decorative use. Which is polite museum speak for, this is fake, but we're not mad about it. Why weren't they mad? Because even a fake can tell a story. A story about obsession, about memory, about how we reach into the past and pull out what we need, whether it's real or not. And sometimes it's not about the truth. It's about the longing for truth. You see that in visitors' faces. Some lean in close to the glass, noses almost touching. Others smirk. A few laugh, but a handful, just a few, stand there in silence, transfixed. Not because they believe, but because they want to believe. It's the same instinct that makes us whisper around campfires. That makes us keep old love letters in shoeboxes. That makes us look up at the moon and wonder if it remembers us. And maybe that's the whole point. Not whether the toothbrush in the case is Napoleon's, but that someone, many someones, believed it could be. That faith, strange and stubborn, stretched across 2 centuries. Let me give you your quirky tidbit of the night. In 2004, a dentist visiting the Louvre's Napoleonic wing made headlines after submitting a tongue-in-cheek proposal. He wanted to carbon date one of the brushes on display and test residual calcium deposits to confirm their age and possible DNA content. The museum declined. Firmly. But in his open letter he wrote something oddly beautiful. If this object passed through Bonaparte's mouth, then it holds in its bristles the last quiet rituals of a world-conquering soul, a moment before battle, a moment before death. That is worth studying, not just scientifically, but spiritually. He later admitted he'd been half serious, but the public loved it. For weeks, the press debated the Napoleon DNA question. Late-night shows joked about cloning him from a bristle. Historians rolled their eyes. And yet, the story stuck. Because deep down, we all understood what was at stake. Not just science, not just validation, but connection. A brush, like any object that passes through a life, gathers something invisible. Some echo of thought, some whisper of presence. A vibration maybe, too faint for instruments, but not for the imagination. And so here we are. In a room lit by halogen bulbs, surrounded by signs and silence, looking at an object that may or may not have ever touched Napoleon's teeth. And still, it touches something in you. The quiet part, the wondering part, the childlike dreaming part. That believes, even just for a moment, that history isn't cold. It's warm, it's soft, it's bristled, it smells like mint, and it can still be found in the drawer of a collector, in the bottom of a trunk, or behind glass in a museum you almost didn't visit. You're almost asleep now. Your breath is slower. The fire in your mind flickers into warmth. And the toothbrush? It stays. In a case, or a drawer, or maybe just a story, still brushing softly against the edge of time. You wake slowly into a dream. Not quite night, not quite day. You're in a white room now. Not royal, not rustic. It hums faintly like a refrigerator or a thoughtful whisper. The walls are lined with stainless steel. The air is filtered. The lighting is even, clinical, like the pause between a breath and a question. This is a lab. And it is not just any lab. It is the kind where objects go to tell the truth. Somewhere, carefully sealed in a clear box, resting on a cradle of foam and acid-free cloth, is a toothbrush. Ivory handle, slight curve, no visible engraving. Bristles almost entirely gone. A museum sent it in anonymously, too cautious to say it came from Napoleon, but too hopeful not to test it. Because science, if anyone, might finally answer what collectors, curators, and conspiracy theorists have all been wondering for 200 years. Was it really his? Now you hover over the technicians. They wear gloves. They speak in hushed voices. One lifts the brush with a tweezer grip, turns it gently beneath a microscope. The other takes note of the wear patterns, the bristle sockets, the pigmentation near the handle's base. It smells faintly of old mint and dust. Just faintly. They'll try a series of tests: carbon dating, spectroscopic analysis, chemical residue, DNA swabs of the wax-crusted base. But the problem? Toothbrushes don't keep secrets easily. The ivory can tell you age, but not the hand that held it. The bristles, if any survive, might give you proteins, but not identity. The calcium fragments lodged in the socket could be dental. But even if they are, Napoleon's DNA is not exactly sitting around waiting for comparison. You see, historians still argue whether the supposed locks of his hair preserved in various museums and books are even real. Some tested positive for arsenic. But then again, arsenic was in almost everything during that time. Wallpaper, scented oils, hair cream. So the data floats, unmoored. And yet, people still hope. Because what if? What if this was the brush? What if this object once sat in a brass basin, dipped in mint and salt and Napoleon's breath? What if the grooves worn into its side were from the thumb that wrote the Napoleonic Code? What if the faint discoloration wasn't mold, but memory? The scientist reviewing the results frowns, shrugs, writes inconclusive in the final report. And that's the best it ever gets. No definitive answer. No red stamp saying genuine. No flash of truth. Just a toothbrush. Still ancient. Still mysterious. Still possibly, maybe, sort of real. You leave the lab, its hum fading behind you, and drift back into the world of the living, where facts fade and feelings grow louder. You find yourself at a collector's estate, sometime in the 21st century. It's autumn. The wind smells like damp leaves and nostalgia. The collector's name isn't important. What matters is the way he walks. Slowly, carefully, as if each step lands in the past. He opens a drawer, and from it lifts a case. It clicks open like a sigh. Inside, another toothbrush. He says it came from a descendant of Constant, Napoleon's valet. Says the story passed from grandfather to grandson. Says it was hidden during the chaos after Waterloo and resurfaced only when a house in Lyon was being sold for back taxes. The handle is smooth, delicately carved, a tiny N near the base, and it smells not of mint, but of nothing. as if time had brushed the scent away. You ask him gently if he believes it's real. He smiles. "Does it matter?" he says. "The emperor is gone, but the stories are alive." And then he does something unexpected. He hands you the brush, tells you to hold it, and in your hand, it feels exactly as it should. Balanced, warm from contact. Worn in all the right places. You close your eyes. For a moment it's morning in a campaign tent. You hear the shuffle of boots, the quiet rinse, the scratch of bristles against enamel. And when you open your eyes again, you're still holding it, still wondering, still caught in the glow of a story just believable enough to feel like memory. You return the brush to its cradle. He closes the lid, and neither of you say anything else, because some truths aren't proven. They're felt. Here is your quirky tidbit. One online auction in 2016 claimed to be offering a Napoleon toothbrush replica made from 3D scans of a verified museum brush in Paris. Buyers were told they were getting an exact recreation of the handle shape, bristle pattern, and aesthetic styling. They sold out within a week, not because people needed a new toothbrush, but because they wanted a piece of the story, even if it was a replica, even if it had never seen Napoleon's face. It didn't matter. Because in a world flooded with noise, people still crave connection, even if it's fictional, even if it's fleeting, and especially when it comes in the shape of something so small, so quiet, so real. Think about it. All the battles, all the treaties, all the statues and books and medals. And what endures? A brush, a bristle, a bedtime story whispered through generations. You're slowing now, your body soft, your thoughts wandering in loose circles, brushing lightly against the edges of sleep. But let's finish with a walk through Napoleon's memory. You're drifting across Europe again, through museums, private homes, dusty libraries. Every now and then, you pass a drawer, a case, a pouch, and sometimes, just sometimes, there's a brush inside. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not, but it always carries the same weight, the same hush, the same sense that this object, this strange little tool, once belonged to someone who changed the world, but still had to rinse his mouth before breakfast. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all, that behind every emperor is a man, and behind every myth, a molar, and somewhere, waiting in quiet corners of forgotten museums or velvet drawers, there's still a piece of him left, a curved handle, a few bristles, and a whole empire of questions. Sleep now. Brush that thought aside. Tomorrow you'll wake. You'll brush your own teeth. And maybe, just for a moment, you'll smile. Because you'll remember that even legends had morning breath. You're almost at the end now. Not just of the story, but of something more delicate. The hush that lingers at the far edge of history. That gentle space between curiosity and closure. The space where myths lay down their swords and finally take off their boots. Napoleon has been gone for 2 centuries. His empire dust. His bones sealed in a sarcophagus the size of a small boat, resting beneath golden domes in Paris. But the toothbrush? That lives on. Not in one piece. Not in one museum. Not in one drawer or one definitive proof. But everywhere. It has multiplied, like all good legends do. Somewhere, in a flea market, a chipped ivory handle is labeled Napoleon's, we think. In a small-town museum in rural France, a faded display reads, Bonaparte's oral care device, probable. In a British collector's cabinet, a bristle fragment sits beside a spoon said to have stirred his coffee. You start to notice them now. They're everywhere. Not the same brush, but the idea of it. And that's where this story wants to land. Gently, finally, softly. Not in the hard shell of historical certainty, but in something softer. Let's walk slowly through that now. Because you're not really chasing a toothbrush anymore. You're tracing the outline of what makes memory last. Is it proof? Or is it belief? Is it carbon dating and scientific controls? Or is it the warm hush in your chest when you hold something old, and your breath pauses, and a whisper from nowhere says, "He touched this. She used this. Someone lived here." That's what this whole journey has been. Not about Napoleon exactly, but about the bridge between greatness and smallness, the warlord and the toothbrush, the empire and the enamel. Because when you reduce someone down to their most basic human acts, something profound happens. They stop being a statue and start being a person. That's the gift of the toothbrush. You don't need to know battle dates. You don't need to memorize bloodlines. You just need to remember, he brushed. Even when he was losing, even when he was winning, even when he was exiled, even when he was dying, especially then. Let's go back, just once more, to that final island. St. Helena, middle of the South Atlantic, isolated, humid, remote. This is where Napoleon spent his last years. And yes, even there, the brushing continued. It wasn't always consistent. Some days, he was too ill. Some days, he was angry. Some days, he just stared out the window for hours. But when he could, he brushed. The accounts are quiet. A valet mentions his morning toilette. A physician writes, his hygiene, though diminished in vigor, remained marked by routine. Even in the journals of his jailers you find mention of his grooming habits. Respectful, resigned, because even they could see. This wasn't vanity. This was identity. A soft defense against the erosion of power. Napoleon's last known toothbrush, if it ever left St. Helena, is lost. Some say it was buried with him. Others claim it was brought back by Dr. Arnott and passed down through generations. A few insist it still sits in a drawer in Longwood House, the former emperor's residence on the island, now a museum. Unlabeled, faded, kept away from the main exhibits to avoid awkward questions. But no one knows for sure. And maybe that's how it should be. Because the toothbrush never wanted fame. It was just doing its job, quiet, useful, unpretentious. And in doing so, it became the one object that followed Napoleon across every version of himself. The ambitious youth, the victorious general, the crowned emperor, the defeated exile, the legend every morning before orders, treaties, betrayals, he brushed. Every night, before sleep or strategy, he brushed. Every bristle stroke was a reminder that greatness is built not just on grand moments, but on repetition. One motion, repeated, with intention. You're slowing now, aren't you? Breathing just a little deeper, eyes heavier. The story settling like dust in a quiet drawer. Let's let it rest. But before we do, let's go back, full circle, to the very beginning, to a drawer in a forgotten Paris antique shop. The bell above the door jingles softly as you step inside. The place smells like old paper and polished wood. Somewhere near the back, beneath a faded military medal and a cracked music box, sits a toothbrush. No glass case, no bright light. Just a little label that reads, Napoleon's toothbrush. Believed genuine. Ask for details. You don't ask, you don't need to. You just look at it. And you imagine him, standing in front of a candlelit mirror, sometime in 1804, fresh from a coronation, or a battlefield, or a heartbreak, holding the brush, tilting his head, brushing slowly, eyes tired. And in that moment, you understand something no historian could write. That this small act, this daily motion, is what makes us human. Not the victories, not the titles, not the gold or the glory, but the brushing. You lean back now. Sheets warm, room still. A last breath in. A last thought. That somewhere, even now, a story this small is still brushing softly against the edge of time. And tonight, it brushed against you. Wind down And now, you can let go. The brush is still, the story quiet. The world has slowed to a hush just for you. There's nothing left to chase. No more maps, no more medals, no more mustached auctioneers or dusty museum drawers. Just you, and the warmth of sleep waiting patiently beside you. Let the last images drift like leaves in still water. An emperor brushing in a tent, steam rising from a silver bowl. A soft cloth patting dry a mouth that once commanded nations. A tiny object packed and unpacked again, carried not for ceremony, but for comfort. Now it rests. And so can you. Your body sinks a little deeper into stillness. Shoulders loosen, jaw softens. The last of your thoughts swirl gently, then fade like bristles worn smooth by time. You did enough today.